Hello, Internet friend. I'm David Ravel. And today on Value Side, it's President Trump's economic scorecard. We've never had a president who sought to slow the economy, although there have been several whose policy brought about that unfortunate condition. I would argue, for instance, that President Lyndon Johnson's gun and butter policies resulted in an extended period of GDP growth below historic trend. The same could be said for Richard Nixon's wage and price controls, or Jimmy Carter's use less energy policy. All of these and others were well-intentioned but financially flawed, presidential actions that resulted in periods of lower economic growth. Now, Donald Trump is rapidly joining this group of perhaps well-meaning but misguided presidents. U.S. chief executives who believed that they were providing policies that would help promote prosperity, but in the end made prosperity more unattainable. In Donald Trump, we see a significant unconventional chief executive. Although his resume is replete with substantial business background, chiefly as a real estate developer, he also had great success in the media with a highly rated reality television show, The Apprentice. It is just the sort of pedigree that Americans wanted in a president who would help boost the economy. In his effort to provide for American economic growth, Trump has offered essentially three different policies: the One Big Beautiful Bill, trade tariffs, and recently the economic dimension of the Iran war. Let's look first at the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The OBBBA is generally viewed as an extension of the Tax Cuts and Job Act signed into law by President Trump in the waning days of his first term. This assessment rests primarily on its extension of the tax cuts of the 2017 bill. But the 2025 OBBA goes far beyond its predecessor in specifically directing the nation's economic direction. Now, the OBBA focuses on providing substantial funding for defense, clearly a Trump priority, while also promoting tax incentives for the traditional energy sources of oil, gas, and coal, and adding high-income households to the beneficiaries. On the other hand, specific cuts were aimed at renewable energy companies and an estimated $500 billion cut to Medicare over the next decade. Thus, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act carried out Trump's essential philosophy of rewarding the winners and reducing the social safety net, while substantially enhancing the War Department. As for the major economic impact of the OBBA, there is a growing consensus among most major macro models that it will provide a short-term stimulus. These estimates range from a high GDP growth of 1.2% by the Tax Foundation to a low estimate of just 0.7% by the Tax Foundation and the Yale Budget Lab. However, all those estimates agree that over time, it's the deficit created by this OBBA that will have the largest impact. By all estimates, the OBBA will increase the country's debt by between $3.7 and $5.1 trillion. And it's those payments on the debt that will drag economic growth lower. Looking more than 10 years out, this debt drag is projected to bring economic growth down to the 0.5% level in the most optimistic estimate, and to a whopping negative 3.3% decline by that Yale Budget Lab. It's hard to see how any financially prudent citizen can score the One Big Beautiful Bill Act as positive for the economy. Next, a look at those trade tariffs. Now, on April 2nd, 2025, President Trump announced Liberation Day, the day that America stopped getting, quote, ripped off by the rest of the world. The premise of Trump's argument for tariffs was that international suppliers were taking advantage of the American consumers, and that by adding tariffs to the equation of international trade, we, quote unquote, would benefit and ultimately become rich. Now beware of Trump's use of the term we. The we he's talking about is the federal government, the collector of those tariffs. But the beneficiaries that he claims are supposed to be the American citizens. According to the president, when fully implemented, tariffs would provide enough revenue to balance the federal budget and even provide a $2,000 dividend check for American citizens. Unfortunately, for those counting their newfound wealth, all that came to naught when the Supreme Court struck down the major provisions of Trump's tariffs and upheld a lower court ruling. During the brief time that the Trump tariffs were in effect, from Liberation Day, April 2nd, until the Supreme Court decision on February 20, 2026, several questions about the tariffs' efficacies were answered. The first was that, unlike the president's claim, tariffs are indeed a tax, and a tax that can only be passed into law by Congress. Many, including the president, had argued that tariffs were not a tax, but rather a strategy that allowed under the president's emergency trade authority, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. In other words, the president had overstepped his authority. But the more relevant economic impact of the tariffs was that they raised prices. As it turned out, those luckless American consumers were forced to pay higher and higher prices on the imported goods that they purchased. And with an economy built in no small part on imports, this became a crucial factor in the hike in affordability, that is, in increased inflation. Several studies are out now indicating that it was the domestic consumer who paid the tariffs. Perhaps the most significant political report is the report by the New York Federal Reserve. What's more, there appears to be little or no reshoring of the goods and products that America regularly purchased. In May, the U.S. trade deficit rose to $77.6 billion. A major increase in consumer products, particularly pharmaceuticals, cell phones, and automobiles, drove the hike. With the administration promising to reinstitute tariffs under another legal umbrella, it looks like few, if any, businesses want to come back home. At the end of the day, it looks like the chief accomplishments of the tariffs were to raise prices for consumers and put the affordability issue front and center for the coming midterm elections. Let's look at Iran and the flaw of energy independence. There is a fundamental flaw in the way we describe American oil independence. You've no doubt heard the mantra, America is the largest oil exporter in the world. Inevitably, this statement is followed by its corollary, we don't need to import oil. It's a way of thinking that portrays the U.S. as entirely oil independent. After all, if we have enough oil to satisfy our own needs and yet export our surplus overseas, we must be independent, right? After all, President Trump often repeats that we are the largest oil producer in the world, and he thereby implies that we also are entirely independent from other producers. Well, it turns out that in a global economy like the one we have today, things are not always that simple, and a little background here is in order. The first thing to understand is that here in the U.S. we produce primarily a light, low viscosity, sweet, low sulfur oil, an oil that takes a particular type of refinery. While most of our neighbors, Canada, Mexico, and yes, Venezuela, produce a heavy, high viscosity oil that requires an entirely different refinery. Finally, most American refineries were built back in the 70s and 80s when we were importing a substantial portion of our oil needs. Naturally, we imported that close by, heavy oil from those neighbors. Then 25 to 30 years ago came the fracking revolution, an entirely new extraction technology which allowed oil companies to obtain oil from fields that used to be considered unworkable. And just like that, America began producing more oil than it could use. But our refineries had not kept up. We were stuck with refineries for heavy crude, yet we produce light, sweet crude. The easiest solution, and the one that we took, was to export our light and import the heavy for our heavy refineries. Bottom line, according to the latest figures from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, while we export slightly over 10 million barrels per day, we nonetheless import about 8.5 million barrels per day. So while it's true that America is a net exporter of oil, but we are far from energy independent. If the countries we import oil from suddenly cut us off, our refineries would run dry. We would have to retool and rebuild existing refineries to process only the U.S. light sweet crude. While it's possible that we could retool our complete refining complex, it doesn't make economic sense. And further, in a changing oil environment where new sources of light or heavy may suddenly become viable, it would be an unwise bet on future sources. With that background, now let's look at President Trump's approach to the Iran conflict. As noted, President Trump repeatedly announces that the United States is the largest oil producer in the world, and implies, therefore, that we are immune. He further claims that when the Strait of Hormuz reopens, things will get back to normal, and the price of gasoline, diesel, and other petroleum products will return to their prior levels. His line of thinking is entirely unrealistic. As we've seen, crude oil is not fungible. Light crude, for instance, cannot be exchanged for heavy crude. Light requires one type of refinery, heavy another. The genius of the previously free global market has been that it perfectly matched the method of refining to the type of oil used. Trump has vastly oversimplified this issue by assuming that all oil is essentially the same. What's more, Trump has carried out this basic fallacy in the oil markets over to all the West Asian natural resources. Included in the list of those resources that requires special processing and transportation are natural gas, petrochemicals, hydrogen, urea, ammonia, polymers, and to name a few. Everything from plastics to fertilizer to the heavy industrial ingredients that go into making our American consumer-based society. Any careful examination of the presumptions and assumptions that went into planning for this war reveal a woeful lack of appreciation for the incredible complexity of the modern global economy. When Trump struck Iran, he really struck at the heart of today's international trade-based commercial system, the result of which will be much more severe than even the most pessimistic economist now believes. The American standard of living is at risk. And that's today's Value Side. For all of our articles and podcasts, visit valueside.com. I'm David Ravel. Value Side is independently written and researched. The views expressed are strictly my own.